One cult from every state. So if we're going to talk about cults, let's start with the definition. Google actually gives us three, which I'll read to you now. A system of religious veneration and devotion directed toward a particular figure or object, a relatively small group of people having religious beliefs or practices regarded by others as strange or sinister, and a misplaced or excessive admiration for a particular person or thing. Since we are covering each and every single state, please be aware I don't have time to cover every single detail in every case we're going to cover. That being said, I do want to say a big thank you to the sponsors that keep this channel afloat, and speaking of, today's sponsor is Dragon City. This video is sponsored by Dragon City, the free-to-play game that's available on iOS, Android, Windows, and Amazon. In Dragon City, you can train, feed, and watch your dragons grow as they become more and more powerful in battle. Prove that your dragon's strength and determination have the power to take over the leaderboard. There are over 1,000 different dragons, so don't worry, you'll definitely find one you become emotionally attached to and pretend they're one of your own. I mean, why did they have to make them so cute? I mean, you can't blame me, right? Just look at the way he's eating his apple. Look at the mohawk. But of course, that's not all. Construct and customize your dream city with magical habitats, buildings, and decorations. While in quests, you can unleash your dragon's skills and strategies to overcome whatever obstacles come your way. Join the lively community of players and collaborate in alliances to unlock exclusive rewards. Bro, Dragon City literally has over 450 million installs. If that sounds interesting to you, download Dragon City by clicking the link in the description or scan the QR code and get a special bundle with 15,000 food, 30,000 gold, plus the very rare Iceling dragon to get you started. And now let's head back to the video. Washington. Members can make gold out of thin air. What if I told you that there's a school that could teach you how to levitate, predict the future, and turn objects into gold? That might sound like something straight out of a fantasy novel, but this school it's actually out there. It's called Ramtha School of Enlightenment, and it was founded by a woman, J.Z. Knight, who claims the ability to channel the spirit of a 35,000-year-old warrior. The story is pretty insane, and it starts with J.Z. Knight, a woman who, in the late 1980s, began getting on headlines for her claim that she could channel a being named Ramtha, the warrior from 35,000 years ago who has transcended time and space to teach humanity the secrets of enlightenment. In 1988, she took things a step further by founding Ramtha School of Enlightenment, or RSE, this being in Washington State. The goal? To teach students how to unlock their inner power and create their own reality. A little strange though is that their curriculum is for the most part based on Knight's channeling sessions with Ramtha, and according to the teachings, human beings have untapped abilities that can make them superhuman. Think of levitation, energy healing, raising the dead, and even manifesting gold out of thin air. Also interesting is that students at RSC practice various techniques to unlock these abilities, including intense meditation and breathing exercises, blindfolded archery, navigating mazes to sharpen their intuition, and even energy healing. To the outside world though, all this sounds very new age. But RSC claims they're not part of the new age movement. They say their teachings are completely unique. Critics argue that RSC is more of a cult than a school. Why? Well, for starters, the campus is a private, fenced compound that's only open to staff and students. Outsiders are not welcome. Former students have also made some serious allegations. They claim that RSC uses mind control and intimidation tactics to keep people in check. There have even been accusations of brainwashing. And as for the promises of superhuman powers, critics say there's no proof that anyone at the school has ever levitated or made gold appear in their hands. Oregon. Wild, wild country. First bioterrorist attack. This one for Oregon is pretty wild. I mean, what else would you say for a spiritual guru who preached free love, in the sense of frowning upon marriage and single partners, and who also owned 90 Rolls Royces, claimed Jesus was a madman, and was behind the first bioterrorism attack in US history? I'm talking of Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh, aka Osho. He's actually very infamous for building a utopian commune in Oregon and turning it into a living nightmare for the locals. There's a lot to this story, but the short of it is that in the late 1970s, he rose to fame in India as a guru with radical ideas. His teachings were all about spiritual enlightenment and sexual liberation. He rejected traditional values, frowned upon marriage, and as I mentioned, preached a lifestyle of quote free love. His message? Well, it was society's rules, live fully, embrace pleasure, and let go of all restrictions. Pretty soon, he got the nickname Sex Guru from the press. His wasn't just about sex though. He also praised capitalism and, interestingly enough, believed poverty existed because religions glorified being poor, and he practiced this capitalism. He lived a lavish lifestyle, collecting more than 90 Rolls-Royce cars and other luxury items. In 1981, he then brought this movement to the US, specifically to a remote commune near Antelope, Oregon. Thousands of followers known as Rajneeshis moved there to build with him. The locals, though, understandably so, weren't really excited to have a mystical, free-love commune pop up next door. That created lots of tension. But then things got even darker. In 1984, with a local election coming up, the Rajneeshis decided they needed more control over antelope. Their solution? Carry out the first bioterrorism attack in US history. They poisoned local restaurants with salmonella bacteria, making over 700 people sick to keep locals from voting so that Rajneeshis could take over the town council. FBI of course got involved, and Rajneesh blamed his right-hand woman, Ma Anand Sheila, who eventually fled to Switzerland, as Rajneesh himself got deported from the US. California sparked the satanic panic of the 80s and 90s. Weird fact, the Helter Skelter song by the Beatles somehow inspired one of the most infamous murder sprees in history. Sounds insane, but it's actually true. The case in question is that of Charles Manson. The man was so twisted with his ideology and had a cult-like influence that he left a permanent scar on Hollywood's power brokers scene and single-handedly sparked the satanic panic of the 80s and 90s. So here's the gist of the story. Manson, who dreamed of stardom, became obsessed with the song Helter Skelter by the Beatles so much that he believed it predicted an apocalyptic race war that would wipe out society as people knew it. His followers, the Manson family, equally got sucked into his interpretation of the song. Now, some think he ordered the murders of actress Sharon Tate, celebrity hairstylist Jay Sebring, and a day later, Rosemary and Lino LaBianca as a way to kickstart the said apocalypse, but others think it was revenge against Hollywood's power brokers, and that he just mistook Tate's house for one belonging to a producer that denied him a record deal. Anyway, in terms of operation, Manson and his cult preyed on young, vulnerable women searching for freedom in the counterculture of the late 60s. He lured them in with spiritual talk and promises of enlightenment, but behind the scenes, it was nasty. He traded them for sex and loyalty. It's actually said that his influence and crimes got so bad that they marked an end to the 1960s free love sort of carefree era. Paranoia and caution took over as people realized that even peace-loving communities weren't really immune to violence. Manson, who was at that point considered a career criminal, he spent much of his early life in prison for petty crimes, was eventually convicted to first-degree murder. He spent the rest of his life behind bars until his death in 2017. Since then, his cult's murders have inspired countless books, films, and documentaries. Alaska, out in the wilderness living off the land. This one is a tragic case of religious extremism, isolation, and abuse, all set in the remote wilderness of Alaska. It's the case of Robert Allen Hale, also known as Papa Pilgrim, who presented himself as a devout Christian, but did the complete opposite of that if we're being honest. The start of it is when he moved his family, his wife and 15 children. Yes, you heard me right, 15. He moved them from Fairbanks and Homer into the wilderness of McCarthy to escape what he claimed were the sins and vices of modern America. But behind the image of a simple religious life was a rather terrifying reality. First of it being that Hale denied his children any formal education, teaching them only his interpretation of the Bible. Then they lived off the land, hunting and poaching for food. Even crazier though, cut off from society, these children were raised to believe the outside world was dangerous and sinful. And as if that wasn't enough, as it would later be revealed, Hale's control had gone much deeper. His eldest daughter, Elishaba, for instance, later revealed that her father was a violent and abusive man, and that the children were forced to obey his every command, and any disobedience led to severe punishment, like withdrawing anything fun and being overworked, even starving. Rather unfortunately, this abuse, as revealed by Elishaba in an interview, included her father essaying her repeatedly, day and night, for years. In 2007, Hale's stint came to an end though after Elishaba made a daring escape to McCarthy on a snowmobile, hiding 5 days under a tree to make sure she wasn't found. The case eventually got to authorities and he was arrested and charged with essaying the 19-year-old daughter. Hale died in prison in May of 2008, just 8 months after his incarceration. Idaho got it wrong. The world didn't end in 2007. What happens when a man convinces himself and others that he's the Messiah? Well, that situation is exactly what happened with Wayne Curtis Bent, also known as Michael Travisor to his devoted followers. His story is actually a pretty mind-boggling example of religious extremism, prophecy, and touches on a so-called day of judgment that never came. Once a pastor in the Seventh-day Adventist Church, Wayne Bent is said to have eventually left with a claim that the church was corrupt, calling it the quote, daughters of the great harlot, the ones condemned in the book of Revelation. Now, just as a side note here, we're covering this under Idaho because that's where Wayne and his cult were originally situated, Sandpoint, Idaho to be specific. Soon after, in 2000, Bent claimed he had a divine encounter right in his living room where God spoke to him directly, telling him that he was the Messiah, the embodiment of God. He famously stated, "I am divinity and humanity combined." With this self-proclaimed title, he formed a religious community in New Mexico known as Strong City. His followers believed they were part of a sacred mission and that Bent was the key to their salvation. But things started to get really concerning when rumors of jetpacks began to spread. This invited attention with, for instance, British journalist Alex Hannaford traveling to Strong City to investigate the contemplated in 2004. His report, filled with eerie and unsettling details, was published in the UK. Barely 3 years later, in 2007, a documentary titled The End of the World Cult aired, bringing even more attention to the group. Among other things, the documentary revealed Bent's apocalyptic prophecy that October 31st, 2007 would mark the Day of Judgment. He had combined biblical numerology and historical events to reach his doomsday prediction. He started with the year 1517, when Martin Luther kickstarted the Protestant Reformation. He then added 490 years, based on biblical prophecy, to arrive at 2007. And as for the exact date, it was tied to the day Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the church door. Though, like we all know, October 31st came and went. Yes, guys, the world didn't actually end. Instead, the group's activity drew the attention of law enforcement. In 2008, Wayne Brent was arrested and convicted of sexual misconduct with minors in his cult. He got out on parole in 2016, diagnosed with cancer. Nevada told his wives to, quote, shoot it out with the cops. There's probably nothing as insane as acting in an Oscar-winning film and then ending up in jail for essaying minors inside of a cult that you ran for years. As unbelievable as it sounds, this is the real story of Nathan Chasing Horse, an arguably known actor featured in the Kevin Costner film Dance with Wolves, who had the secret organization The Circle that had all the nasty underpinnings of a cult and turned out to be very much so. According to reports, Chasing Horse, aged 46, was arrested and booked into Clark County's jail, charged on 2 counts of sex trafficking and SA of a child lower than the age of 16 and child abuse. All this apparently happened from as far back as the early 2000s as he led his cult The Circle under the guise of being a, quote, medicine man and holy person. He was charged in Nevada particularly because that's where he lived for close to a decade and had been involved with victims that lived in the state. FYI, he had victims in other states as well, including South Dakota and Montana. Now, there's of course a lot to his story, but 2 crazy things that stand out are, 1, that he once took a minor as a wife, having been gifted her by her mother after one of his healing sessions with that mother. 2nd, he gave his wives, quote, pills sometime between 2019 and 2020 that they were to take in case he got arrested so that law enforcement couldn't, quote, break their family apart. Oh, and he also asked his wives to, quote, shoot it out with the police officers, again, if they tried breaking the family apart. They were to actually try that first, and then if it failed, then they were supposed to take the pills. Anyway, he is still sitting in jail. Utah. White supremacist, homophobic, anti-government, and totalitarian. How does a religious leader become one of the FBI's most wanted? Well, the story of Warren Jeffs answers this question pretty comprehensively. The dude ran one of America's most notorious cults, destroying countless lives along the way through manipulation and a bunch of horrific crimes. His tool? Well, a church. The Fundamentalist Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, with locations in small towns along the Utah-Arizona border. As it would later be found out, behind this lengthy name lay a disturbing reality that the church wasn't just a religious group. No. Allegedly, it was a polygamous sect that operated in plain sight, and apparently for years, they managed to avoid serious legal consequences. They were so vile that they got branded as being a concoction of white supremacism, homophobia, anti-government, and totalitarianism. Anyway, it wasn't until 2003 when a police officer named Rodney Holm, yes, a police officer who was also a member, was convicted of unlawful conduct, SA, with a minor and bigamy. This turned out to be a major case for the church, only coming second to the historic Short Creek raid that had the church face legal action. And then, away from that officer, there's this whole other side of the church's woes where Warren Jeffs, the leader, faced a long series of issues with the law, arranged illegal marriages between adult men and underage girls, fled from authorities, and even made it onto the FBI's most wanted list. He was caught and charged in 2011 and got life in prison for essaying 2 child brides, one just 15, the other one just 12 years old. Arizona. Leaving? They'd hand you over to Satan for destruction. So from what we've seen so far, it's nothing new for a church to turn into a controlling cult, and this one is just more proof of that. The case is that of Pastor Isaac Noriega, a church leader in Arizona accused of leading the Golden Dawn Tabernacle, a cult with so much unchecked power and the usual script of control, fear, and secrecy. So this church is supposedly connected to a movement called Branhamism, founded by William Branham, a self-proclaimed prophet who believed he carried the spirit of Elijah and claimed to be a prophet, saying he had a direct line to God. His teachings emphasized extreme separation from the outside world and a strict interpretation of the Bible. Pastor Isaac Noriega built his church around these ideas. According to former members, Pastor Noriega took control to extreme levels. Members were told to cut ties with anyone outside the church, including family and friends, and were also discouraged from contacting authorities, even when serious abuse was happening. And if you break the rules, well, beyond being kicked out of the church, you would be, quote, taken out from under the blood of Christ, and handed over to Satan for the destruction of your flesh. That and a bunch of other crazy stuff, including victim blaming and decades of inaction against abuse. Montana. They were wrong. The world didn't end in 1990. Here's how I'd summarize this one. A group with lots of mystery, secret teachings from ascended masters, and a leader with the crazy claim of being the reincarnation of the Virgin Mary. Case in question is the Church Universal and Triumphant, an organization branded by some as a New Age movement and in the headlines for a somewhat controversial past. So, the Church Universal and Triumphant, or CUT for short, dates back to 1958, founded by a man named Mark L. Prophet, who claimed to be a, quote, messenger for spiritual beings known as Ascended Masters. Mark's teachings were heavily influenced by two earlier spiritual movements, Theosophy and the I Am activity, both largely focused on mysticism, reincarnation, and spiritual enlightenment. All that was a little unsettling, but then after Mark's death and his wife Elizabeth Clare Prophet took over, things got a lot more interesting. Elizabeth, seen as Guru Ma or Mother within the church, taught that Mark had become an Ascended Master himself, now called the Ascended Master Lanello. She believed that all people have an inner spark of divinity and that through spiritual practice, we can reach oneness with God. But then her teachings didn't stop there. She took things to an apocalyptic level, even making apocalyptic predictions about humanity's future, claiming that dark forces were working to stop humanity's spiritual progress. She even predicted an end of the world that should have happened in 1990, courtesy of a nuke war between the US and Russia. This mix of doomsday prophecies and talk of mystical ascended masters led many outsiders to label the group a cult, and this meant that the criticism kept flowing even as her influence kept getting less and less, especially when doomsday never happened. She died in 2009. Wyoming. Wife led a cult until her husband mysteriously disappeared. This one is a wild case from Cheyenne, Wyoming, from back in the 2000s. The story starts with this chill couple, call them the Rosses, that had moved into a modest fourplex in downtown Cheyenne. 303 East 17th Street to be exact. Nothing had seemed odd about them until the husband, Alan Ross, suddenly disappeared in 1995, and people spent years looking for him. His mysterious case drew attention all over the place, and people started suspecting the wife, Linda Green. But since there was no body or any other evidence, she never really got charged with anything. Then, in 2000, a new twist came and unearthed quite a lot about this seemingly innocent couple. The body of Ross, who was a filmmaker by the way, was discovered beneath their house. This was disturbing in many ways, but mostly because his wife, Green, had been a cult leader up to the point of Ross's disappearance. Actually, it was right after Ross went missing that Green disbanded the cult and sent everyone on their way. It also became known that the couple had moved to Cheyenne from Guthrie, Oklahoma, where they had lived in a converted prison with Green running a cult, the Samaritan Foundation. She had moved with her followers. Now, like I said, Cheyenne never got charged, but then in 2005, one of her followers, Julia Williams, got 34 months in prison for helping in the murder of Ross. Why not charge Green too? Well, she had died 3 years prior in 2002 of natural causes. Anyway, as it stands today, that house where Ross was found is an art gallery, the Zelms Fine Art Gallery. And interestingly, the cult's odd headquarters in Oklahoma, the converted prison, got featured on the show Ghost Adventures. Also, 2 documentaries came out of this case, Missing Alan in 2001 and Deadly Devotion in 2013. A pretty bizarre case in general. Colorado. To them, the US is the Great Satan. By this point, you could probably tell that predicting an apocalypse isn't anything strange to a cult. This next cult took it a little bit further. They predicted an apocalypse, vanished without a trace, and reappeared in a different country, only to then be deported for endangering a holy site. Their story starts with Monte Kim Miller, the founder of the group The Concerned Christians, claiming that he was the prophet of the Lord. He believed God spoke directly through him and gave him the mission to get all Jews to convert to Christianity. As you might imagine, that turned out chaotic, and over time, it earned them the label of being a terrorist organization. Interestingly though, starting out like a normal community leader and even working with law enforcement, establishing churches, and warning against the dangers of cults and mind control, Miller had ended up a hardcore cult leader himself. That's especially when he began interpreting biblical prophecies about the apocalypse by linking them to political events in world history. This change could actually be attested by those around him. A Denver police officer, Mark Rogaman, who once supported Miller's work, for instance, said Kim Miller was on our side of the fence, and Concerned Christians was a good name. But But that changed when the group started making wild claims. What sorts of claims, for instance? Well, how about the belief that the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 was a clear sign the end times were near? They also saw American patriotism as a betrayal of true Christianity and even labeled the United States as the Great Satan, claiming its government was controlled by demons. Anyway, things would get much worse. Somewhere along the way, out of nowhere, 60 to 80 members of the group vanished. Then they were discovered in Israel. What were they doing there? Well, you have to remember their mission was to convert Jews. Also, Israeli authorities suspected the group posed a threat to the sacred Al-Aqsa Mosque, one of the holiest sites in Islam. In a preemptive operation called Operation Walk on Water, the officials arrested the members and deported them, effectively ending their activities. New Mexico. Court seized their property, so they destroyed it. In 1981, a couple, James and Deborah Green, also nicknamed the Generals, began a church organization by the name Aggressive Christianity Missions Training Corps. It was originally just your ordinary Christian outfit, believed in one God, the Trinity, the Bible, etc. It also drew some inspiration from the Salvation Army and took on a sort of military structure. Fast forward to 2017, Deborah Green is jailed for 72 years while her husband, James Green, gets 10 years in 2018. Their son-in-law, Peter Green, and their son, Joshua Green, also facing the court on different but related charges. So what went wrong? Well, lots of child essay and rape cases, and I mean a lot. Peter Green, the son-in-law to the Generals, for instance, had 100 counts of essaying minors at the church, and all those people I mentioned were charged with the same crime in one form or another. There were also charges of failure to register kids at birth that involved other members like Amos River, Victoria River, Ruth River, and Timothy River. And beyond all that, the Generals had been on the run from the law. This had happened after one former member, Mara Schmierer, sued them and won $1.02 million. In a crazy twist though, while on the run, the court seized the cult's property in California, that's where they were originally based, to pay Schmierer. But then, somehow, the couple found ways to destroy those buildings. They then moved to Oregon and renamed the cult Death Force Team, before then moving to Gallup, New Mexico. They also at one point were called the Free Love Ministries, an arguably weird name considering what they got charged for. Anyway, it was in New Mexico that they were finally arrested. Hawaii. They thought colloidal silver cured COVID-19. Next up is Love Has Won, aka Galactic Federation of Light, arguably one of the wildest stories in modern cult history. It starts with Amy Carlson, who, once an ordinary woman, got dragged deep into New Age philosophy through shared interest on the subject with others, all of them using a forum, lightworkers.org, to, quote, educate each other. While there, she met this man named Robert Saltzgaver, aka Amaranth, White Eagle, and together, they literally became the core of Love Has Won. Robert particularly convinced Carlson, who they now refer to as Mother God, that she was a 19 billion-year-old divine being, and that he was Father God. Carlson took this to heart and somehow began engaging in the paranormal. She, for instance, claimed to have reincarnated as Jesus, Cleopatra, Joan of Arc, and even Marilyn Monroe. Their theology? Well, a bizarre mix of New Age spirituality, conspiracy theories, and Abrahamic elements. They even offered etheric surgeries, claiming to cure illnesses and remove negative energy. But behind the scenes, things got dark. It became apparent from ex-members that the group engaged in physical abuse, sleep deprivation, members only got 4 to 5 hours of sleep, with Carlson herself being said to be drunk and abusive. This was a rather damning revelation because it just confirmed earlier fears that Carlson had simply taken the wrong turn in life. She had left her husband and kids and abandoned her job as a manager at McDonald's to dedicate herself to the group, at one point even ending up in Kauai, Hawaii, calling herself Pele, a Hawaiian goddess. Anyway, fast forward to years later, in 2021, Carlson was found dead at a house near Crestone. She'd ingested a lot of silver, colloidal silver to be specific, which the cult believed could cure COVID. Her body had been sort of mummified as it was found in a sleeping bag, her face covered in glitter, with Christmas lights wrapped around her, like a shrine. She had been dead for a few weeks, and members of the cult got charged with abuse of a corpse. North Dakota. They wouldn't donate to his cult, so he abducted their kids. This one is about a tight-knit family that got torn apart by an honestly weird minister hell-bent on preaching hate, greed, and manipulating members. The man in question is Gordon Philip Winrod, the leader of Our Savior's Church, a platform that he used to spread extreme anti-Semitic propaganda, and he was very much invested in that. He even had these writings known as Winrod Letters, where he called Jews child perverts and accused them of running a secret Jewish world government. As you'd imagine, most were turned off by this whole thing, but then some liked it. That's how the family bit comes in because, well, enter the Leppert family from North Dakota. Impressed by his teachings in 1978, Roger and Dolores Leppert, along with Gordon Kahl, traveled to Missouri to meet Winrod. They wanted his guidance. Unfortunately, that quickly spiraled into something much darker. First, under Winrod's influence, 3 of his daughters married 3 leper brothers, creating a tightly woven and toxic, I must say, family network. Winrod began by demanding loyalty, which he got. Then second, he decided that he wanted money too. He demanded the leopards donate their farms to his church. That though wasn't easy to get. 2 of the brothers refused, leading to bitter divorces and escalating tensions. Winrod, furious at losing control, took drastic action. In 1994 and 1995, he abducted 6 of his grandchildren, determined to keep them within his control and sort of punish the parents. He kept them isolated, indoctrinated, and cut them off from the outside world. A lot went on after that, but like we've established, these cults don't end well. This one came down to Winrod getting sentenced to 30 years in prison. South Dakota. Meet God the Mother. There's a South Korean-based organization that has been called out 2 times now for trying to evangelize and gain members in South Dakota. And just so you know, they're not getting called out simply because they evangelize, no. They apparently carry a rather unique message that most are uncomfortable with. According to them, there is no Holy Trinity. Instead, there is God the Father and God the Mother. Also, their tactics in doing so are less than ideal. In 2019, for example, one woman, Abby, said that she had been walking with a friend and the friend's daughter when they got approached by someone from World Mission Society Church of God, and that man invited them to Bible study. But when they refused, he apparently reached into his bag, took out snacks, and offered them to the little girl. The mom refused, and still the man allegedly, quote, got more aggressive, like in our face. They had to push past him. This happened in July of 2019, and it was one of at least 3 similar cases that have been reported to the police in Sioux Falls. Even more problematic is that this church has been described as a cult by former members. Colin, one such member, said that she had been in the cult for 4 years and could confirm that it was indeed nothing more than a profit-making scheme that used fear and control to keep people inside. Also, it carried what would be considered hallmarks of a cult. For example, their doctrine stated that they were the one and only true church that was established by God. They also believed for anyone to be saved, they had to meet God the Mother, an elderly lady named Jean Gilja. And apparently, the cult's leaders had predicted the world would end in 2012, something cult leaders are fond of doing. When asked though, the organization denied all these allegations, stating that if they were not upfront, no one would join them. Nebraska. Next up is the Rulo cult, led by a man named Michael Ryan back in the early 1980s, and trust me, this is among the crazy ones. So starting with the teachings, Ryan believed and preached that the white race was chosen by God, and that everyone else was descended from Satan. He also preached hatred of race traitors, and told his followers to distrust the government, claiming it was all part of some evil conspiracy. And as if all that wasn't bad enough, he had his followers preparing for what he called Armageddon. And no, not the asteroid kind, the race war kind. They started hoarding weapons and supplies, gearing up for this apocalyptic showdown that honestly existed only in Ryan's head. But like most cults, and we've already seen this, money became a big issue. And so, to keep the group going, Ryan had his followers committing burglaries, because apparently crime was fair game in his divine mission. Now, where things take a rather unpleasant turn is when Ryan's control over the group got more intense, and his behavior became worse. He, for example, had a run-in with his 26-year-old follower named James Tim, and ended up torturing and killing him in ways so brutal, they're hard to even describe. And as if that wasn't enough, he also allegedly ordered the death of a 5-year-old boy, Luke Stice, the son of one of his followers. Good thing though is he didn't walk scot-free. He was arrested sometime in 1985 and got convicted of 2 horrific crimes. He's been sitting on death row ever since. Kansas. Killed cult members to cash in on life insurance. Imagine a secluded commune led by a man claiming to be an angel, and not just any angel. No, this guy Lou Castro told people he had supernatural powers, could perform miracles, and even predict people's deaths. And above all that, he lived large, fancy cars, luxury homes, and a life straight out of the Rich and Famous handbook. But here's the thing though, he had no income, no job, and no other clear income source. Surprisingly, he did this for a while without any trouble, and it wasn't until 2003 when things changed. A 26-year-old woman, Patricia Hughes, one of his followers, was found dead at the Angel's Landing compound. She'd had a rather suspicious drowning accident. Then her husband died 3 years later in a plane accident, though unrelated to her death. Anyway, police, led by local detective Ron Goodwin, started digging and soon enough found a lot of shady things. Turns out there was a disturbing pattern. Lou's inner circle crashed in on big life insurance policies every couple of years. Coincidence? Not at all. They were taking out insurance on members and cashing out when those members died in quote accidents. It wasn't long before the FBI got involved. In 2010 though, under all the scrutiny, Lou fled Kansas for Tennessee, taking on a whole new identity. But he couldn't hide forever. The FBI eventually caught up with him for identity theft and fraud. It would also be uncovered in a weird twist that his real name was Daniel Perez, a man with a long history of crimes, including horrific SA. Investigators uncovered years of abuse at Angel's Landing, with one survivor, Sarah McGrath for example, bravely coming forward, saying that she had been for years. In 2015, Daniel Perez was convicted on 28 felonies and sentenced to 80 years in prison. Oklahoma. They're a superior race and America is their promised land. Most people would remember the Oklahoma City bombing and the man that was said to be behind it, Timothy McVeigh. What is little known though, arguably, is that there had been rumors that McVeigh was associated with a movement called Christian Identity, a cult hidden in rural Oklahoma that had some of the most unhinged teachings ever. Founded in the Elohim City community in Adair County, this group was started back in 1973 by a guy known as Robert G. Miller and adopted a secrecy kind of lifestyle and embraced right-wing extremism. They do, for example, believe that some white people are God's chosen ones and that America, not Israel, is the promised land. They also don't like Jews at all, terming them descendants of Satan, and as for non-whites, they believe those are a lower form of species than whites. Yeah, pretty bizarre stuff. They've been branded different names, for example, Love City, Hate City, and even a nudist colony. Now, a lot remains unknown about this group, and so a lot of rumors still float around. Some, for instance, say they have underground bunkers and weapon storage facilities. They've also been said to be in the illegal drugs business. Also, no one knows exactly how many people there are in that 400-acre piece of land. As of 2015, it had been said to be about 100. Interestingly, most of these people are descendants of the founder Robert G. Miller, which is weird when you consider they don't interact much with outsiders and that they allowed polygamy at some point. Anyway, Robert died in 2001, and then his son took over and he too died later on in 2019. Texas. Claimed to be Messiah, had a 51-day standoff with the FBI. In Texas, we have the Branch Davidians, whose story is wild, tragic, and surrounded by lots of controversy. The cult itself dates back to the 1930s when the founder, Victor Hutif, split from mainstream religious teachings, the Seventh-day Adventists to be specific. Seeing as he no longer believed in the Bible and its claim that Jesus was the Messiah, to him, the Messiah was yet to come. After branching off, he bought land in Waco, Texas, and called it Mount Carmel and led a group there till his death in 1955. One of his followers, Benjamin Roden, took over. Then, in 1981, one among those that had left the SDA church with Hutif, a man named David Koresh, aka Vernon Howell, came and joined the group at Mount Carmel. Thing is, he believed he was the Messiah that was to come. With his deep knowledge of the Bible and a self-proclaimed gift of prophecy, he seized control of the group, and that's when things really went downhill. He, for instance, decided his descendants would be holy like him, and so first he declared that all women, including underage girls and married women, were his spiritual wives. Then, over time, went on to father at least 13 children, claiming they were sacred because of his divine status. Shocking as it is, that was just one side of his leadership. There's this whole other side when he had run-ins with the law because of illegal weapons. Actually, in 1993, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, the ATF, raided the Waco compound, suspecting the group was stockpiling illegal weapons for an apocalypse Koresh had been preaching about. That was followed by the infamous 51-day Waco standoff. Even the FBI got involved. The standoff got so messy, a fire broke out and 76 of the 85 people at the community, including David Koresh himself, died. Minnesota. Said food truck was funding a cult, got sued for $200,000. This one is pretty interesting and has a little bit of everything. Spirituality, identity changes, family drama, and even a food truck named Bad Rooster. So the whole case revolves around Soler Alarai, a spiritual director and lead minister behind Soulful Journey and Living Faith, two organizations that she founded back in the early 2000s. She was what you might call a life expert, basically helping people with strategy and soulful transformations. And she had good traction in that, a spirituality podcast that's racked up over 100,000 followers on Facebook. But here's where things got a little messy and the family drama started. So Kelly Abity and Angela Hummelgard, two sisters, came forward with a rather interesting claim. They hadn't spoken to their mom, Mary Ring, since 2007, and this was right after she joined Soler's group. That's 15 years of no contact. They said their mom ditched her old life, divorced their dad, and even changed her name to Sienna LaJoy. And as you might guess, maybe, she wasn't the only one that did that. Investigators found that 15 other people legally changed their names right after joining the cult. Now, the way the whole thing blew up is honestly a little weird. The two sisters I just mentioned, Kelly Abetty and Angela Hummelgard, apparently saw this food truck named Bad Rooster, owned by a Minnetonka company belonging to Soler Alari Online, and called it out for funneling funds into helping a group that was tearing families apart. Of course, referring to Soulful Journey and describing their mom's case. And just like that, the post went viral, and suddenly, people started coming forward with similar stories. One woman, Grace Yake, even claimed her sister had been brainwashed by the same cult. Soler didn't, however, take all this lying down. No, she fired back. She denied all the accusations, calling them straight up lies, and then filed a $200,000 defamation lawsuit against the sisters. She said her claims cost her half her business. The case was eventually dismissed in July of 2023. Iowa. Angry in public? Well, that gets you less food ration for 30 days. Imagine this, leaving modern life behind. No electricity, no running water, and all that fancy stuff. And moving to rural Iowa and living like it's 2,000 years ago. Don't know how that sounds to you, but it's what this next group, called Essenists, led by former Minister Ron Livingston, did. He and 5 others were fed up with what they saw as a massive disconnect between church teachings and how people actually live their lives in the Church of Latter-day Saints, basically Mormons, and decided to walk away. So by 1987, they bought 240 acres near the Missouri border and began building their own isolated community. They decided to live out there without electricity, plumbing, or even running water. They claimed their simple way of life freed them from the anxieties of the outside world. As Livingston, one of the members, put it, "We don't care about the price of gas. We don't care about the interest rates." And to be clear, this wasn't just an off-the-grid lifestyle. No, it was a way of life modeled after the ancient Jews from 2,000 years ago. This meant the group shared property communally, followed by a strict moral code, and even had punishments for missteps. For example, a public display of anger could get you 30 days of reduced food rations. To what end though? Well, Julie Holtz, another member at the time, explained, "We believe the only way to achieve our purpose is to leave society. That's how we can protect the purity of our community." Missouri. Sovereign beings tasked to remove parasitical invaders. This next one is about a rapper turned into a self-proclaimed god with a following of over 300,000 people, calling themselves sovereign beings. The cult, which goes by the name University of Cosmic Intelligence, has been for the most part internet-based but still raising serious questions. It was founded by Rashad Jamal, who, like I said, is a rapper turned spiritual leader and began calling himself the Divine Insight. At the core, the group believes Black and Latino people are literal gods, whom Jamal refers to as carbonated beings. They also say that Earth is actually called Planet Kai. Together, his community calls themselves the Grand Cosmic Rising Family. The general sense of their beliefs is strange because on social media, for instance, Jamal claimed he was sent to Earth to heal the planet, raise its frequency, and remove parasitical invaders, all which honestly sounds like things out of a sci-fi novel. Now, maybe as expected, it wasn't long before this cult was on the wrong side of law enforcement. This happened when 6 people, including 2 children, disappeared from their homes, and it was suspected that these individuals' disappearances were connected to Jamal's online cult. Neighbors reported seeing some of them outside daily, worshipping the sun. It's a chilling sight that left the community on edge. Anyway, eventually on August of 2023, Jamal was convicted of child and cruelty to children and received an 18-year prison sentence. He denied he had anything to do with the missing people though, and insisted law enforcement put a target on his back. Arkansas. Unpaid child labor and more. Next up is the Alamo Christian Foundation, an American cult started in 1969 by Tony and Suzanne Alamo. Tony had been working in the music industry before receiving a direct message from God to begin his ministry, and what he started was an anti-Catholic apocalyptic empire that expanded into multi-million-dollar businesses and property, including manufacturing decorated denim jackets for celebrities. He wasn't doing things the right thing though. I mean, it was a cult after all. According to former members, the businesses heavily depended on unpaid child labor, abuse, and Alamo's brainwashing. Alamo taught his followers to rely on him to save their souls, which turned into him being their sole source of survival. Quote unquote, "He required us to more or less worship him and not God," said Risha, one member. Anyway, eventually Alamo was convicted of 10 counts of transporting minors across state lines and essaying them. He had apparently started taking on children as young as 8 to be brides, and he somehow tried justifying that. For instance, once quoted saying, "When women start their periods, then they are women, according to God's word." Oh my god. I can't believe I just read that. Shortly after the government raided his church, he was convicted and sentenced to 175 years in prison for the SA and more. Louisiana. Inherited a church, turned it to a cult-like sex ring. For Louisiana, we have this small town church that went from being your everyday place of worship to basically a free reign of SA and abuse. Called the Hosanna Church in Ponchatoula, Louisiana, the organization, described as a cult, was led by one Rev. Louis LaMonica, who had taken over at the age of 45 following his father's death. Somewhere along the way, seems things had gotten quite nasty because in 2005, a woman by the name of Nicole Bernard made a desperate call to the sheriff's office claiming she fled town to save her child from getting S8 at the church. An investigation was set up, and it soon became apparent that the Hosanna Church had unfortunately become a haven for abuse. Authorities said that children as young as 1 1 and as old as 16 were victims of horrific SA, getting SA'd right in the church's youth center, homes, and even cars. Sheriff Daniel Edwards reported that as many as 25 children were involved, and to him, this wasn't just abuse, it was organized. A cult-like sex ring, he called it. 7 people, including LaMonica's wife, and even a sheriff's deputy, ended up getting arrested. And when I say what was going on there was horrific, believe me, because LaMonica himself did, for instance, admit to essaying countless children, including his own sons. He even taught them how to essay others, human and animal. And as for the timelines, the abuse had begun sometime in 1999 and continued for years, finally coming to light in 2005. This case is even suspected to have inspired the show True Detective, but that also has its fair share of controversy. Wisconsin. Made kids mow his lawn with scissors. For Wisconsin, we have the strange story of Abraham Cohen, formerly known as Rama Behera, a man whose journey from his Hindu roots to Christian evangelism and eventually Judaism had him create one of the most mysterious and abusive religious groups around. I mean, he had kids mowing his lawn with scissors. His story begins in 1966 when Behera, a Hindu-born Indian evangelist, claimed that Jesus himself appeared to him in a vision. The vision apparently changed his life forever, making him convert to Christianity. He began preaching a strict anti-modern message which, coincidentally, happened to appeal to Americans struggling with social changes of the time. Think of it as a throwback to simpler days, but with a catch. Behera would, however, soon get over this, and several times over the years he reinvented himself, 3 times to be specific. First, he became Dr. Rama Chandra Samanta Roy and started a group called the Disciples of the Lord Jesus Christ. Then, by the 1980s, he adopted the name Abraham Cohen, abandoned Christianity altogether, and embraced Jewish traditions. Now, for this last group, members allegedly lived under rather strict rules. No Christmas, no birthdays, not even, get this, peanut butter or Italian food. Also, members worked the land and helped maintain Behera's house, and while doing this work, women had to wear long skirts and men had to dress in plain attire. And like I previously said, yeah, he made kids cut grass around his house with scissors. Oh, and he also made final decisions on marriages, baby names, and even career paths. Former members who have come forward have confirmed these disturbing claims: harsh discipline, psychological control, and even abuse. Illinois. Crossed some serious lines. Catholic Church rejected them. Next up is Love Holy Trinity Blessed Mission, an organization that started in Chicago with big ambitions, but ended up in a lot of controversy. So it all began in 1992 with Bible studies and prayer meetings led by 2 gentlemen, Kyle McDonald and Father Len Cruzel, a former priest from the Archdiocese of Chicago. They soon after launched the Holy Trinity Blessed Mission, or LHTBM for short, with the goal being to create a Roman Catholic mission that helped followers build their faith and find meaning in their lives. They were trying to be as legit as it gets, even seeking approval from the Vatican to become their own independent religious order. Controversy could not let them do that though. They instead ended up getting denounced by the Catholic Church. How so? Well, critics say LHTBM has crossed some serious lines, including demanding total obedience from its members, so much so that they're encouraged to detach from family and the outside world. That's where the cult accusations actually come in. And like I've said, they're not approved by the Catholic Church, which they attempted to associate with. Priests, such as Archbishop Jerome Haynes, have warned Catholics to avoid the group entirely, stating it's not recognized by the church. Now, unlike other cults where former members sort of reinforce evidence, on this one, members have spoken out, expressing disappointment over these accusations. They claim LHTBM is deeply rooted in scripture and prayer, and that it's helped them live more meaningful lives. Michigan built a whipping block to keep its members in line. For Michigan, we have this one where obedience was enforced by a whip. Yeah, a whip. It's a rather chilling story of William A. Lewis and his cult, the House of Judah. His story goes back to 1975 when William A. Lewis, a then charismatic radio preacher, gathered a group of devoted followers and led them to a remote communal compound near South Haven, Michigan. He convinced them that he was an Old Testament prophet and called them the Black Hebrew Israelite Jews. Apparently, at first glance, it might have seemed like a devout religious group, but the truth is that it was far from it. Life at the House of Judah came with strict rules that were enforced by brutal punishments. Followers signed agreements to accept public beatings if they disobeyed, including women and children. Lewis justified these horrifying acts by pointing to scripture, saying it was all about raising children under the true God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But that wasn't enough for Lewis. According to DOJ attorney Daniel Bell, being a cult leader wasn't enough. He needed to be feared. So he installed a whipping block to make sure no one stepped out of line. And he took things to the extreme. In 1984, for instance, 12-year-old John Yarbo tried to escape the compound. He was caught and unfortunately was brutally beaten by cult members, including his own mother, who was described as, quote, very faithful in following Lewis's commands. Tragically, John didn't survive. Lewis was blamed for the death and was charged, but was ultimately acquitted of the murder. Instead, he was sentenced to 3 years in prison for his role in the beatings. John's mother received a sentence of 4 to 15 years. Indiana was the origin of the infamous drinking the Kool-Aid. Charisma can be a superpower. I mean, it can inspire, lead, and in some cases, destroy. And Jim Jones, who we're focusing on in Indiana, had that power in spades. Now, right from the get-go, Jones wasn't just any preacher. He was a self-proclaimed preacher that focused on growing his church by leveraging on big promises: racial equality, free meals, legal aid, etc. Generally, progressive ideals that people love, and of course made him seen as a civil rights leader. Even politicians liked the guy. Beneath all that, though, was some ugly stuff. Somewhere along the way, allegations of financial fraud, abuse, and cult-like behavior began coming up. In a sneaky move, seeing as the people were starting to see him differently, he moved his followers, the People's Temple, to a remote settlement in Guyana, known as Jonestown. He promised them paradise and an agricultural utopia. That wasn't the case, though. Instead, the community became plagued with cases of abuse, and Jones himself sank into drug addiction. Fast forward to 1978, California Congressman Leo Ryan, along with a group of journalists, aware of the ongoings of the cult, flew to Jonestown to investigate, specifically the allegations of abuse. What they found, though, was much more than that. Jones, again, was addicted to drugs and had spiraled out of control on matters of leadership. He was also paranoid and tried stopping Ryan, the congressman, and his group from leaving. He had them ambushed and killed. Then, probably seeing no way out of what he did that night, he decided their end had to come. Over 900 men, women, and children in the group were forced or manipulated into drinking cyanide-laced punch, with Jones himself by a gunshot to the head. A rather tragic ending that came to be associated with the infamous phrase, drinking the Kool-Aid. And until 9/11, the case marked the largest loss of American civilian lives in a single non-natural disaster. Kentucky. Teen vampires that went all the way. Among the cases that we've covered so far, this is probably the one with the youngest leader. And it's a pretty strange one, where a teenager convinced his friends that he was a 500-year-old vampire. It's the story of 16-year-old Rod Farrell, a self-proclaimed leader of a cult by the name Vampire Clan. Inspired by the game Vampire the Masquerade, Farrell had created this persona named Visago, a centuries-old vampire, and committed himself to living the persona in full. He then convinced a group of teens enough for them to buy into the fantasy, and together they turned a crumbling, abandoned cement structure in Kentucky called Hotel California into their nest, if you can call it that. And here they performed bizarre rituals, drank each other's blood, and, as investigators suspected, began plotting a murder that they would then go ahead and do. This happened in 1996 when Farrell and the group brutally killed Richard and Naomi Wendorf in Eustis, Florida. Richard, the father of Farrell's close friend Heather Wendorf, was found with V-shaped burn marks on his body, Farrell's twisted symbol. Farrell claimed he was rescuing Heather from what she called her personal hell. No one believed that, and soon enough, Farrell found himself as the youngest person on Florida's death row. And in case you're wondering about the locations, Farrell and her mom apparently moved a lot between Kentucky and Florida. Tennessee. Members share everything. Cults, and hopefully this is clear by now, have a thing for getting people to detach from society. And this next one, called the 12 Tribes, is just like that. They had members abandon belongings, their names, and even their entire identities. Led by Albert Eugene Spriggs, this group started in the 70s as a blend of Christian and Jewish beliefs, but quickly spun out of control, at least in terms of being a healthy community. First, with a little over 3,000 members across the US and beyond, as of 2022, they are alleged to share everything: homes, jobs, meals, and all else really. The goal being to return to the truest form of Christianity. And they do all that by being strict. As per ex-members, for instance, everything was apparently controlled, down to how much toilet paper you could use, 2 sheets by the way, and the exact shape of your eyeglasses, round only. And as you would probably guess, members were reportedly trained to avoid outsiders and even handle the police with carefully rehearsed PR tactics. It wasn't uncommon for police to actually get involved, with the FBI even coming in when things got out of control. The accusations around the group included child exploitation, abuse, medical negligence, racism, sexual abuse, and even murder. That's again over and above all the other stuff that was already going on. Communal discipline, for example. As one ex-member admitted, if you're not beating your kids, you're the one in trouble. Anyway, even in the recent past, the group has not been short of controversy. Their Colorado property, for instance, was investigated in 2023 for an alleged connection to the Marshall Fire, the most destructive wildfire in the state's history. Mississippi. Prepped his followers to take over the post-apocalyptic world. In the 1960s, a man named Samuel Drew Fire Jr. claimed he had received the message straight from God. The message? The world was ending, and he had been chosen to lead the way into a new era. This was the birth of the Move, a group that ended up being a cult. Now from the start, this guy had weird theology. He preached that God was building a divine government that would rule the world after the apocalypse, and so he told his followers they were in God's training school, destined to become rulers of this new world. And as a way to prepare for the new era, he instructed his disciples to set up communes around the globe. These were meant to be safe havens, but they weren't. Bai, for instance, believed children were born with a quote beast nature, something that needed to be beaten out of them before they turned 3. Therefore, regular physical punishment wasn't just allowed, it was encouraged. Some internal leaders like John Henson tried to claim that these communes were places of healing for those struggling with addiction or mental illness, but still the perspective of strict control, abuse, and fear continued. Also, like many self-proclaimed prophets, Fife believed he was invincible. He controlled everything about his cult and believed he'd never die. That came to an end in 1979 though, when his plane went down, crashing into a mountain in Guatemala. Ohio flipped every normal belief upside down. Sometime back in the 1st century CE, there were Christians that practiced Gnosticism. What is that, you may ask? Well, simply put, it's the belief that salvation comes via some secret knowledge. Now, understanding that about Gnosticism brings us to our Ohio cult, Our Lady of Endor Coven, also known as the Ophite Cultus Sathanis. Founded by Herbert Arthur Sloan, it has been described in a satanic cult rooted in ancient beliefs and Gnostic traditions. Sloan and his followers, rather strangely, held a bold perspective. They saw the serpent in the Garden of Eden not as a villain, but as a hero. For them, the serpent wasn't tempting humanity, but offering true knowledge, something they believed was kept from us by the Creator God. And strange is indeed their identity, because even their name, Our Lady of Endor, apparently refers to the Witch of Endor from the Hebrew Bible, a figure who could summon spirits from the dead. And the alternative name, Ophite, is equally interesting as it comes from the ancient Gnostic sect, the Ophites, who revered the serpent. And the last part of the name, Cultus Sathanis, is simply the Latin transition of Cult of Satan. Beyond that, and as strange as it is, Sloan also believed that Cain, the biblical outcast, was the first satanic priest, punished by the Creator of God for performing the original satanic mass. Therefore, all that combined means followers of this cult were the quote true Satanists, walking the way of the serpent and Cain. To Sloan, Satan wasn't a force of evil, but the ultimate source of enlightenment, defying the rules of a world created by what he saw as a lesser god. Alabama claimed that there is a devil in every family. This one takes us to a small, quiet town in Alabama, 1912, where as people lived their simple lives, one man, the tall and imposing John Samuel Barker, decided he was done being an ordinary store clerk and was now Christ himself. Yeah, you heard that right. He decided he was Christ. Barker had begun by preaching to Native American communities, where he soon discovered there was power in his words. He was convincing and could easily draw people to himself. Before long, he wasn't just preaching, he was holding full-blown religious meetings and calling himself Reverend Barker. According to his relative Sally Hess, Barker had a gift and he was using it to the fullest. He could, for instance, quote any part of the Bible. Problem was that instead of preaching love or forgiveness, like a normal preacher would, he twisted the Bible for his own benefit. And somehow he convinced over 70 people in rural Alabama to believe he was the Messiah. Unfortunately, he didn't stop there. Beyond the manipulation, he isolated those that followed him, even extending the teachings to keep it that way. He, for instance, told them it was sinful to bathe or even change their clothes. Why? Well, this was to keep outsiders away. And it worked. The smell alone became a barrier, keeping off curious neighbors. And if that wasn't disturbing enough, Barker taught his followers that there was a quote devil in every family, with the solution being violence, basically sanctioning killings on anyone who didn't follow his doctrine. There's even a chilling rumor that Barker may have been involved in the disappearance and possible murder of a 2-year-old boy. Maine tried running a cult from prison. In the late 1800s, there was a man that built a movement that started with a Bible school and ended in a rather unfortunate tragedy. His name? Well, meet Frank W. Sanford, founder of Shiloh Temple and self-proclaimed prophet. His story goes back to 1897 when he built a chapel on a donated piece of land in Maine. A rather simple beginning, but within years, he'd raised Shiloh Temple to become a massive operation. He raised it so big that at some point, it got hailed as the largest Bible school building in the world. The building was 260 feet long and 40 feet wide. The followers, who grew by day, were called Sanfordites and were described as devoted, disciplined, and maybe a little too trusting. Why? Because Sanford wasn't just teaching the Bible, he claimed he was the chosen Elijah. That's right, the man handpicked by God to lead his people. And his followers believed him. They sold everything, homes, possessions, you name it. All their money went straight to Sanford's Holy Ghost and Us Society. Cracks began to form though, with the first of them being people questioning the strict rules, enforced fasting, and harsh discipline. Then came a case in 1904 that had Stanford arrested for manslaughter for the tragic death of a child under his care. Then in the early 1900s, problems stuck again when he took his followers on a grand missionary trip around the world. Apparently, the voyage was disastrously undersupplied and 6 crew members didn't survive. In 1911, Stanford was arrested again, this time for manslaughter related to the deaths at sea. He went to prison for 7 years and tried to run the cult from there, but by the time of his release, the glory days of his empire were long gone. In the 1950s, most of the buildings he put up were torn down and only one chapel remained. It is currently an evangelical church, not associated with the cult. New Hampshire. They invented a load of stuff that we use today. Next up is Canterbury Shaker Village, home to among the first people to believe God's message could make you literally shake with joy. Their story begins in 1774, where Mother Ann Lee, a woman from England, described as illiterate, had a vision, and a radical one for that matter. After losing 4 children and being imprisoned for her religious beliefs, Anne became convinced she was called by God to start over somewhere else and build big. So she did. She crossed the Atlantic and brought the Shaker movement to America. Why were they called the Shakers? Well, because their worship sessions were simply wild. Picture people trembling, dancing, and shaking, all as they allegedly felt the Holy Spirit. They described it as an intense connection to God expressed through movement. Fast forward to 1792, Canterbury had become one of the first Shaker communities. But these folks weren't just about worship. They lived simply, worked hard, and believed in equality. Their community rejected marriage, gave up personal possessions, and focused on innovation. Innovation in what way? Well, how about their furniture? Clean, minimalist, and timeless. Fun fact, Shaker design inspired modern aesthetics we see today. And they didn't just make furniture, they were inventors too. They're the ones that came up with the circular saw, flat brooms, mail order seed packets, washing machine, metal pens, and a bunch of other stuff. Today, Canterbury Shaker Village stands as a National Historic Landmark and a living museum. So yeah, they had a bit of some weird cultic beliefs, but they had this whole other side of blessing us with useful and productive stuff. Vermont. For them, filthiness was next to godliness. This next group was so extreme that for them, not bathing was a core belief. Called the Vermont Pilgrims, they were led by one Isaac Bullard, a man that, probably similar to other cult leaders, had pretty wild but convincing claims. It all started in 1817 when Bullard recovered from an illness and declared himself a visionary, claiming he could receive divine revelations. But here's the kicker. No one could really put a finger on what he was preaching. His doctrine was a mix of self-denial, harsh discipline, and outright strange practices. Bullard, for instance, believed humanity was riddled with sin, and salvation had to be earned through grueling challenges. For his followers, this meant giving up comfort. Like all comfort. Meals? Just thin gruel or flour water broth eaten out of a communal bowl. No forks or knives allowed. Too modern and corrupt for his taste. Oh, and chairs? Forget about it. You stood while eating because sitting was just a little too civilized. I mean, the man was obsessed with purity, but then he was also proudly filthy. He bragged about wearing the same clothes, or as he called them, skins, for 7 years. Why? Because according to him, the Bible didn't command Christians to wash, so naturally bathing was forbidden. As if that wasn't enough, he also claimed power over marriages and dictated every aspect of his followers' lives. And yet, despite these extreme beliefs, for some reason, people followed him. Him and his crew wandered from town to town, searching for their so-called promised land. Massachusetts. Want to lose weight? How about some sin and guilt? You'd expect an organization called Community of Jesus to be rather Jesus-like, right? Well, this one seems to have been pretty far from such a reputation. In fact, it's alleged that members who left the group once they became adults described their exit as escape. Now, Community of Jesus, found in Orleans, Massachusetts, somewhere on Cape Cod, has origins from back in 1958, and basically was meant to be this organization that brought Christians from other denominations together to work as a team. With approximately 225 members, they all lived in a commune of about 30 privately owned homes around a church and guest house. Among them, and this is where it starts to get iffy, they have 25 celibate brothers and 60 celibate sisters. Why? Well, we don't know. Something clear though is that they've had weird practices going on in the community, given 3 documentaries, one by WZ-TV and 2 by CBC's The Fifth Estate. They all established that there was some form of abuse there. One such includes the 3D weight loss program that Kay Anderson, a leader in the program, promoted. Diet, discipline, and discipleship. The issue was that it was focused on sin and guilt as a way to lose weight. Also, their affiliation with Grenville Christian College has brought up some legal troubles, with a judge ruling that there was evidence of maltreatment and varieties of abuse on students' bodies and minds. Then, as one Redditor put it, the kids are brainwashed to believe the community is normal because of exchange programs between the 30 households. I mean, if all the neighbors are doing the same exact thing in their house, then it's okay, right? Rhode Island. Need eyeglasses? That's a no. they're a sin. This one isn't exactly in Rhode Island because it's technically in southeastern Massachusetts on the Rhode Island border, but I guess it'll have to do. Rhode Island has actually done well on not having very notable cults, and that probably has something to do with how tiny the state is. Anyway, the Body, as they're called, is a fundamentalist group that decided to reject modern medicine, the government, and basically science as a whole. Interestingly, they're made up of two large families that go as far back as 1978, when a man named Roland Robidoux exited a different group, the Worldwide Church of God, to form his. He had felt that the rules of the Worldwide Church were too strict and he needed a church that would, quote, truly serve God. That turned into weekly Bible study with his family, and soon enough they had as many as 70 members. Now, although he left his former church due to strict rules, as his members grew, he became more and more controlling, including asking them to cut ties with anyone that didn't share the same faith as them. He had them change their diets, and because traditional worship music at the time wasn't cutting it, he had them compose their own. Anyway, going back to the abandoned society bit, according to Carol Balizet, one of Robidoux's close associates, they did this because society had, quote, Satan's 7 counterfeit systems of education, medicine, commerce, banking, entertainment, schools, and government. These were actually part of the instructions they claimed they received directly from God. They would have these sessions called leadings, where members apparently heard directly from God. And among other things, he told them that glasses were a sin. They had to throw away books, DVDs, movies, and photographs. Also, women were to only wear dresses. I mean, there was a bunch of other stuff, but you get the point. A truly strange organization. Connecticut. Told members he had to sin so he'd know how to stop sin. Next up is Brother Julius Shacknow, or at least that's what his followers called him. Slightly built, piercing green eyes, and always dressed in a flowing white robe. This guy was probably the model image of a cult leader. He, for example, claimed he wasn't just sent by God. No, he was God, a Jesus Christ reincarnate. Alright guys, the jig is getting old. If you wanna become a cult leader, it looks like everyone claiming that they're Jesus, it looks like everyone does it. Everyone says they're God or Jesus to some degree. Y'all gotta switch it up at some point. Now, this sinful Messiah, as he called himself, had a rather twisted worldview even beyond the God claim. He, for instance, argued that he needed to sin in order to truly understand evil, and then eradicate it from the earth. Well, in reality, as you might maybe guess, his so-called divine mission was just an excuse to sin. An example is him saying that he could heal addictions and illnesses through sex. Yep, you heard that right. He convinced his followers that sleeping with him was a sacred act, and that of course came with a bunch of other weird stuff. Forced marriages, exploitation, and chilling counts of SA cases, including one involving his own stepdaughter, who alleged years of SA at his hands from age 11 all the way till she was 18. Another thing is that while manipulating his followers, Shacknow wasn't just building a spiritual empire, he was also raking in cash. He created a multi-million-dollar real estate network off of members' contributions, although it eventually came crashing down. New Jersey, a series of cult-like events. New Jersey, late 1970s, no formal cults, no infamous names, just a chilling series of events that could have been linked to something rather weird. Rumors of satanic rituals. One particular trigger event being the mysterious death of 20-year-old Patrick Michael Newell. Patrick's death was strange as it was thought to be a ritual killing. According to his friends, Richard Williams and Wayne Swikert, Patrick was part of a Satan worshiper sect that had him have an ultimate goal of dying violently so he could supposedly command 40 leagues of demons. And rather bizarrely, these two friends helped him fulfill his wish. They taped him up, performed what they called a satanic ritual, and pushed him into a pond. And just to be clear, this was beyond rumors, as even the police confirmed that Patrick had some sort of connection to a group believed to have thought of itself as a satanic cult, and under the group's influence, he'd apparently attempted to before. They described his death as with assistance. Now, the reason I said cults for New Jersey are more of a series of events rather than specific organizations with infamous names is because right within this timeline, just a few towns over in Franklin Township, investigators stumbled across what they believed was a voodoo cult. Dolls wrapped in black cloth, stabbed with pins, and tied to trees. Even creepier, the dolls had names written on their feet. Real people's names. Detectives never found out who was behind it, but there was a general sense that it could have been a cult activity. New York branded his initials on members. Self-help groups have always been popular, and what started off as a self-help organization by Keith Rainier ended up being nothing short of a cult and a scam. It enticed people with workshops promising ambitious self-actualization and happiness, and did that so successfully that at one point it had more than 18,000 members, primarily in North America. The quote organization, named NXIVM, had a secret circle of women who were coerced into being intimate and branded with Rainier's initials. These women were put on strict diets, and to make sure that these activities remained discreet, Rainier required collateral such as naked photos or something that would damage their reputation. The recruiting was done by actor Allison Mack, the master who brought them to be slaves under the disguise of a mentorship program. They instead joined a pyramid scheme within the group with Rainier, who, by the way, was weirdly referred to as Vanguard. To be part of the group, said one former member, they had an initiation tattoo ceremony where they were instructed to say, "Master, please brand me, it would be an honor." Rainier's initials were marked right above their pelvic area. Once reports of the branding and other forms of abuse began surfacing, investigations followed on it were clear that Rainier was guilty of SA. Oh, and that was just one part of it. Eventually, his crimes were identified to have extended to alleged identity theft, sex trafficking, and racketeering, among others. He was found guilty and sentenced to 120 years in prison. So strange was the story that it inspired two thrilling docuseries, The Vow on HBO Max and Seduced Inside the NXIVM Cult on Starz. Pennsylvania, maybe the worst depraved cult ever. Seems like there's no end to depravity because the more cults we cover, the deeper the insanity goes. This next one, for instance, led by a man named George Feigley back in the 1940s, had members convinced that an orgasm has transcendent and mystical powers. And believe it or not, that wasn't the worst thing they had going. Found in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, this group ran both a church and had associations to a school, the Neo-American School. And in both situations, sexuality was like the main pillar. They thought of it as the most available expression of divinity, with sex being apparently the greatest act a human being can do. And that's not hearsay, no, that's directly drawn from their manifesto. Rather, unfortunately, as unearthed in police reports, this church's doctrine basically sanctioned essaying kids. They believed it was okay to use them for sexual gratification. I mean, it was outright depravity, with even the leader, Feigley, authoring a book describing the essay of a 10-year-old. He did so under a pseudonym, Gigi Stockate. Eventually, Feigley was arrested in 1975 and sentenced to 10 to 20 years in prison. He then escaped from the SCI Rockview prison just a year later by scaling the prison wall, but was recaptured in 1978. Then he escaped barely a month later, only to be captured again after about 2 months. In his absence, the organization kept operating, and honestly what they were doing, for instance when a 1983 raid was done in his home, is unspeakable for a YouTube video. Feigley eventually got arrested in 2008 amid a lot of protests from community members. He died a year later from poor health. Delaware. Do stuff, just don't tell your parents. For Delaware, what we have is more of an investigative report alleging cult-like activity at a well-known school, the New School. Although branding itself as a safe haven offering a progressive alternative education model, apparently former students and parents have accused it of fostering a toxic environment where students were subjected to emotional and physical abuse by staff members. These allegations include incidents of public humiliation, inappropriate physical restraints, and neglect of student safety and well-being. Some also claim the school failed to address bullying among other students and came after those who raised any concerns in that line. There's a case, for example, where an 11-year-old got hit with a metal pipe by an older male student, and when they told their parents about it, the school's co-founder, Melanie Heiner, yelled at them because disputes should be handled internally. Then there was a Thunderdome Fight Club, where students had physical fights in the school's backyard with no intervention. That's according to someone who went there in 2005. This was also in addition to widespread drug use where teens would go out of the institution and come back in looking visibly under the influence. Their excuse for going out would be to go grab a bagel down the street. Allegedly, this went on because there was no strict supervision. So in general, stuff like that, together with the law book of confidentiality, led some to compare it to a cult. Maryland forbade members from doing charity work. In the 1970s, the American Catholic Church was perceived to be in a state of spiritual decline. And as a solution, Marylander Dave Nodar and his wife, Cheryl, envisioned a kind of New Jerusalem, a haven in what they called Charm City. In this new community, the couple and their leaders encouraged their members to give up the modern world when they joined in. And typical of cults, there wasn't just one rule, there was a lot more. Families were, for example, instructed to avoid television, news readings, and even charity work. According to Nodar, talking to the Baltimore Sun in 1984, do-gooders mean well, but they tended to fall into Marxism. Marxism here being bad because of promoting materialism. Therefore, in an attempt to preserve their members, he reckoned it was better to focus on one's soul than become involved in humanist causes. Members were also threatened that they would lose spiritual cover if they left the group, and the devil might pop out to get them anywhere, even the grocery store. According to Audrey Claire Farley, a former member, women submitted to their husbands, gave birth to as many children according to God's will, while men were to avoid domestic work or child-rearing activities. In her case, which was similar to others, she was taught that feminists were miserable. Patricia Whitman, who lived around the block from this group, seemed to think of them as beautiful on the outside, but full of dead men's bones and every kind of filth on the inside. Virginia, a summer camp with a cult-like behavior. Virginia's case is much like Delaware in the sense that this story is more of an investigative report alleging cult-like activity rather than a full-blown cult. It's the story of Association of Research and Enlightenment, aka ARE, a well-known organization chaired by Laura Little that helped summer camps in Virginia. They had been doing well until 2020 when it came to light that there had been a dangerous cycle of SA and cover-ups that had gone on for generations. Now, while the leaders of the organizations rejected the claims, there was a whole court case going on with 8 girls having come forward with incidents of getting SA'd while at the camp. Lindsay, one of the girls, said in an interview that she attended the camp age 13 and was SA'd by a male counselor, and when she reported, she got victim blamed. Worse still, she had returned to the camp a few years later and was put through a very cult-like ceremony where she had to forgive the guy after being told it was her job to forgive him as the community depended on unconditional love. The organization was blamed for not reporting the case to law enforcement for the 11 months that they knew about it. Another girl, Hannah Furbush, also came forward confirming incidents of exploitation, for example, recalling they had to participate in the quote, liberated underwear movement, end quote, an event where underage female campers would run through the camp under the watch of male staff in their underwear. West Virginia. Racketeering, mail fraud, and even conspiracy to murder. Did you know there was once a slice of India hidden in the hills of West Virginia? Well, meet New Vrindaban, a Hare Krishna community founded in 1968 by Kirtanananda Swami, along with Hayagriva Das. Named after a holy town in India, it started as a part of the International Society for Krishna Consciousness, better known as ISKCON or the Hare Krishna movement. This New Vrindaban, while starting out as a small spiritual retreat, didn't stay that way for long. By 1979, it had become the largest Hare Krishna commune in the US, drawing visitors from all over who came to marvel at Prabhupada's Palace of Gold. Picture lush gardens, intricate carvings, golden domes, and even an elephant strolling around. Now, that's about as much as a positive sight as there is to it. Eventually, Swami, one of the community's leaders, began to make waves for his criminal convictions. That became a PR issue, so much so that in 1987, ISKCON expelled him for moral and theological deviations. What followed was a spiral of scandal, charges of racketeering, mail fraud, and even conspiracy to murder 2 critics, Stephen Bryant and Charles St. Denis, who threatened to expose his essay of minors within the community. By 1991, Swami was convicted on 9 charges and sentenced to 20 years in prison, and since he was the co-founder of New Vrindaban, he took the organization's reputation down with him. They did recover somehow, and as of today, the community still stands as a vegetarian haven with alcohol and drugs strictly forbidden. Its history of mix and devotion and controversy still raises questions though. North Carolina. Married couples still couldn't have sex unless permitted. Jane Whaley, a math teacher, and her husband Sam Whaley, who was a car salesman, started Word of Faith Fellowship in 1979. This was after they converted a former steakhouse into a chapel. According to the late Carl Sagan, Word of Faith believers believed the world was demon-haunted and even the most faithful were prone to demonic possession. So they had believers practice a ritual termed the blasting, where they exorcise these demons. The quote-unquote possessed were surrounded, shouted at, shaken, and other times pummeled to drive out evil spirits. On some occasions, those getting exorcised were brutally thrown against walls. Then, to keep everyone close and controlled, members were encouraged to move to Spindale, North Carolina, where they lived communally and followed strict rules such as not watching television, not reading newspapers or books other than the Bible or fellowship literature. Oh, and not eating in restaurants that served alcohol. Marriages were often arranged at the church at the age of 18, and once married, couples couldn't have sex without the permission of the church. Some ex-members stated that a wedding night was limited to a hug and a kiss. Interestingly, although women were forbidden to wear makeup, Jane Whaley, the founder's wife, had expensive outfits and a lot of jewelry. And she wasn't nice. She apparently was known to have a temper bad enough to get her to face assault charges in state courts. These cases, though, amounted to nothing as both the Rutherford County Sheriff and the local district attorney garnered votes from Word of Faith members and neither followed up on any of the charges. Also, Word of Faith members had key jobs in the courthouse and sheriff's office to keep tabs with what was going on. South Carolina. Left civilization, grew their own food, dressed the old way. In 1978, Ralph Gordon Stair declared himself a prophet and launched the Overcomer Ministry. By the 1990s, he had grown in influence so much that he was on about 120 radio stations. Now, like clockwork as it is with cults, his focus shifted and money took center stage. This began with him buying a motel in Waterboro, South Carolina, and then, in a very dramatic twist, urging his followers to abandon their lives, sell everything, take a vow of poverty, and donate all they owned to his ministry. He sort of envisioned this community that was centered on simplicity and self-sufficiency, growing their own food, making their own clothes, and living by strict old-fashioned dress codes. And he partly achieved that, but not for too long. Somewhere along the way, cracks began to show in the whole thing because of some teachings. He, for instance, discouraged medical intervention and tragically 3 infants died during or shortly after birth within the community. That also meant local authorities had to become involved. Eventually, in 2002, he was arrested and charged with 8 crimes, including 3 counts of first-degree criminal sexual conduct, and there was lots of evidence as followers came forward with horrifying allegations, claiming, for example, that he coerced them into sexual acts under the guise of God's will. One woman in particular revealed she had been raped at least 35 times, with Stair allegedly having told her that she'd made the man of God happy. Georgia had 100 kids to his name. This next one claimed to be an alien and a prophet. Called Malachi York, this infamous leader was head of the United Nubian Nation of Moors, a cultic organization that ended up destroying lives, especially those of young women. So bad was York's actions that he actually got sentenced to 135 years in prison for transporting and essaying children. Now, starting with the teachings, York's teachings were a bizarre blend of religions: Islam, Judaism, Christianity, and Egyptian mysticism. And as time went on, his claims got even stranger. He declared himself Chief Black Thunderbird Eagle, the leader of a lost Native American tribe, and even claimed to be an extraterrestrial from the planet Rizq. Yeah, Rizq. R-I-Z-Q, Rizq. Oh, and a descendant of the Prophet Muhammad too. But his beliefs weren't the only thing coming up as stranger. It was his absolute need for control. According to former member Nikki Lopez, York's followers lived under brutal conditions. Children were separated from their parents, beaten with wire hangers and broomsticks, and starved by York's concubines. It was a cult in every sense of the word. And that's just one part of it. Minors, for instance, were apparently groomed to serve him as sex slaves, and it was only after these underage girls began showing up to local hospitals to give birth that authorities got alarmed. The police raided his Georgia compound in 2002, rescuing 5 children and uncovering a census book documenting nearly 100 of York's children. The evidence was further strengthened by testimony from former followers, including his own son, who all exposed the truth. In 2004, York was convicted of his crimes, and like I mentioned, he got 135 years in prison. Florida used cult money to play casino and visit strip clubs. What if you were promised blessings beyond measure, but only if you gave up everything you knew? Well, that was the case of Charles Made and his Mountaintop Ministries. Founded in the 1970s by Charles Made himself, this organization had initially been called the Made Ministries, with the message or core belief being, live life above sin, reject all worldly ideas, and God will bless you like never before. Pretty tempting, right? By the mid-2000s, his teachings had attracted over 2,000 followers. Made even declared Florida as the promised land. And yes, that sweet talk even got some people to uproot their lives elsewhere and move to Florida. But here's the kicker. Once you moved, you had to cut off anyone who didn't join in. Friends, family, literally everyone. For 25 years, members stayed isolated, living under strict control. But everything changed in 2010 when Charles Made passed away and his son took over. He seemed to try and undo his father's damage. He finally allowed members to reconnect with their loved ones after decades of separation. The problems weren't quite over yet though, as in 2015, a scandal rocked the church as women came forward accusing Made of sexual abuse. Also, while this was being investigated, other stuff came up, including allegations of church funds being used for secret casino and strip club trips by leadership. And before the video ends, don't forget about Dragon City, and make sure to click the link in the description or scan the QR code to get a special bundle with 15,000 food, 30,000 gold, and the very rare Iceling Dragon. And that's just to get you started. Big thank you to Dragon City for sponsoring this video. Alright guys, that was it for this video. That was one cult from every state in America. So if you liked it, make sure to leave a like. If you think I earned your subscription, and if you're not subscribed yet, make sure to subscribe. That was a lot to read. Wow. Not really much else to say. I'll see you guys next time I upload.